If you're a gamer of a certain age, you might recall flicking through magazines and regularly being promised the magnificent-looking Nintendo 64 DD. It was said that this disc drive add-on would drastically enhance the Nintendo 64's capabilities, allowing us to engage with larger, more expansive experiences than what was possible with cartridges at the time. However, mainly due to cartridge compression technology improving throughout the console's life cycle and Nintendo viewing the disc drive's moving parts to be prone to failure, the disc drive would end up being released exclusively in Japan and mainly functioning as a home to niche artistic software. But before any of this occurred, we were pitched and shown many great games that would be arriving on the hardware that sadly never arrived on the add-on. So with that said, joining me today as we look back at these unreleased offerings and celebrate what was never meant to be. I am Lady Decade and this is the Lost Library of the Nintendo 64 DD. The legendary Ocarina of Time was at one point planned to be the system launch title for the Nintendo 64 DD, in the same way that Mario 64 was the important release for the base hardware. Nintendo decided to move it to cartridge format quite early on, although fear was rife that the development team would struggle to create the game they wanted due to data storage constraints. In fact, a backup plan was concocted to give the game the same structure as Mario 64, whereby Link would use Ganondorf's castle as a central hub in order to enter the different realms. Fortunately, due to the development of Nintendo 64 cartridges with double the storage capacity, no cutback was ever needed. However, what is interesting is that even after the game was moved to a cartridge, 2 expansion packs were in the works that would have been played through the disc drive and functioned in the same way as modern DLC. The first of these, known as Ura Zelda, would have potentially added new dungeons to the game and introduced a more difficult version of Ocarina of Time. This expansion pack effectively evolved into the Ocarina of Time Master Quests that would come with copies of The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker for the GameCube. As for the second expansion, this one was known as Zelda Gaiden and looked to expand the world and story that Link could experience. This even more ambitious expansion would ultimately morph into the standalone Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, but in an alternative universe, we could have got a very different Zelda 64 experience. While Animal Crossing is considered one of Nintendo's biggest franchises in the world right now, what's interesting is that not a lot of people know that the first game was intended to be released on the Nintendo 64 DD. Those who have been playing the Animal Crossing games for a while may recall when the series arrived in the West on the GameCube. However, in Japan, the first entry in the series was available on the Nintendo 64. That's right, like many games planned for the Nintendo 64 DD, this game, known as Animal Forest, was repurposed to instead run on the base 64 hardware instead. Sadly, many elements would need to be changed. For example, the DD version was said to have taken advantage of the expanded memory and the internal clock. This meant that the game would need to be mechanically changed, as the animals in the title's sleep and wake cycles would be affected by this clock. Reports suggest that Animal Crossing was intended to be a goal-orientated game, including the likes of dungeons, bosses and monsters, but with memory limitations in place, the developers opted to create an open-ended addictive game which focused on small tasks to keep players coming back. So tell me, do you like how Animal Crossing ended up, or would you have preferred to have played this version instead? Yoshis Island 64 was a game in development for the 64 DD platform, eventually morphing into what would have become Yoshi's Story. Early screenshots and beta footage of the game shows a title that at one point looked very different. Unseen 64 notes that the beta level had a black background, water and giant mushrooms, as well as some enemies that were bigger than the ones in the final game. The soil was covered in moss, and we could notice huge flying bubbles that Yoshi was able to move. Due to the disc drive's shortcomings, it's not surprising that developments would ultimately shift. However, I must say, this beta footage is cool to see. You've all heard of Shigeru Miyamoto franchises such as Super Mario Bros., Donkey Kong and The Legend of Zelda, but have you heard of Cabbage? That's right, working alongside designers such as Satoru Iwata and Shigesato Itoi of Earthbound fame. These icons of the industry worked together on the cancelled Cabbage. Cabbage was said to be a breeding simulator, with Miyamoto speaking eagerly about this upcoming game at the end of the last century. Nintendo staff was said to have loved this title, with there being comparisons drawn between that of which Cabbage was and a virtual pet. It's not surprising that Nintendo wanted to go down this route, considering how huge Tamagotchis were in 1997. No screenshots have ever been shown of this one, and while we can speculate the project was canned due to virtual pets being no more than a craze, what we do know for sure is the individuals involved with the creation of this one would also have their hands full with bigger and more expansive projects. Oh yeah, and did I mention that, like Animal Crossing, this whole game was built to function around the DD's internal clock, meaning porting it to the base 64 would have required considerable reworking. Ultra Donkey Kong is a video game that was promised for the 64DD. There's not much information online that indicates whether this version of Donkey Kong 64 would have been much different from what arrived on a cartridge, but what is interesting is that an element would be dropped from the game that was intended to have been included in the cartridge version. This game, along with Banjo-Kazooie, were both intended to allow for a feature known as Stop and Swap, which would have allowed data transfer to unlock in-game bonuses. The foundation of this idea was built around the fact that Rare discovered the Nintendo 64 held flash memory for several seconds after a cartridge was removed. So, for example, the hope was that by removing one Rare game and replacing it with another in quick succession, the existing memory could be used to unlock content. So, if you're a gamer out there who wondered what that mysterious key was for behind the ice in Banjo-Kazooie, well, now you know. It was part of the intended stop and swap. Nintendo was concerned about this quick swapping of cartridges having the potential to damage consoles, and that the system would not retain RD-RAM long enough for this to work consistently. In fact, shortly after the release of Banjo-Kazooie, Nintendo went as far as to manufacture consoles with a reduced amount of time that flash memory could be retained. Petty, but it worked. Everyone always seems to talk about when Final Fantasy left Nintendo hardware to become PlayStation games, but for some reason people rarely talk about Dragon Quest doing exactly the same thing. Dragon Quest VII for the Sony PlayStation was originally officially announced to be a Nintendo 64 DD game. While Dragon Quest has never exactly been huge in the West, in Japan it is considered one of the most important video game franchises of all time, with the huge commercial success of Dragon Quest inspiring Final Fantasy itself. Dragon Quest was big business. This was by no means a small event, with Japanese stock analysts at the time describing the scenario as a crisis situation for Nintendo, with some industry observers losing faith in the entire 64 line. In fact, Dragon Quest VII on the PlayStation would become one of Japan's highest selling games of all time. Fire Emblem 64 was set to be the Nintendo 64 DD's entry in the classic Fire Emblem series. Franchise creator Shuzo Kaga stated in an interview back in January 1999 that the game was too ambitious for the hardware. The development would completely change direction, with the Intelligent Systems game being completely reworked and released on the Game Boy Advance in 2002 as Fire Emblem The Binding Blade. It's of note that The Binding Blade would not see a release until 3 years after Kaga had left Nintendo to open his own studio to create the Fire Emblem-like series known as Tear Ring Saga on, you guessed it, the Sony PlayStation. Amusingly, the game was originally titled Emblem Saga, with the similarities between the two franchises causing Nintendo to try and sue Kaga for copyright infringing the very series Kaga had created in the first place. The Nintendo 64 DD released in Japan would function as the home for 3 Mario Artist titles, software that turns the 64 DD into an internet multimedia workstation. Usable via the RandNet service subscription package, the Mario Artist series was essentially the evolution of Mario Paint, with Japanese players receiving Paint Studio, Talent Studio, Polygon Studio and Communication Kit. However, there were another 4 Mario Mario artist titles that unfortunately never saw a release at all, so let's quickly discuss them. Amongst this lost lineup, according to the Lost Media Wiki, these would have included Mario Artist Game Maker, software that would have allowed players to make their own levels, much like with Mario Maker many years later. Building on these obscure oddities, Graphical Message Maker may have allowed 64DD users to paint messages and send them to other players. Sound Maker would have likely been a title where players could manipulate sound. As for Video Jockey Maker, well, I'll leave that one for you to speculate about. Who remembers being excited about Mission Impossible, a game that received far more hype than it deserved, simply due to its aesthetic and thematical similarities with that of the universally acclaimed GoldenEye? This Ocean Software developed title, which had no chance in hell of living up to expectations, was amusingly planned to be released on the Nintendo 64 DD over a year before GoldenEye even came out. However, perhaps more interesting is that when you go back and look at the first images that were ever shown of the game, it looks much better than what we could enjoy in reality. Unseen64.com notes that the very first images released looked like a high-definition version of the game with a cleaner graphic that was unthinkable for the real N64 hardware. Today these screens can make us smile, but in 1996 these target renders were the most beautiful graphics ever. The final version of the game had no such graphic detail, with blurred out polygons and textures. Sneaky. No wonder there was so much intrigue around this one. Super Mario RPG 2 was slated as the long-awaited sequel to the original Mario RPG for the Super Nintendo. Like its predecessor, Nintendo approached Square to develop the second game. However, they turned down the offer, wanting to focus creative energy on the next Final Fantasy game. This would see Intelligent Systems being contracted to take on the project, with footage of the 64DD title playing at the Space World 1997 trade show. With the 64DD technology being considered somewhat of a flop, like with many games that we have talked about today, development would switch to the base 64 itself. Jack and the Beanstalk was the name of a project that Satoru Iwata worked on, in which you could take pictures, taking advantage of the 64DD's special clock feature, like with many games mentioned today. The title, however, didn't have much marketing appeal, so it would be transformed into a little title known as Pokemon Snap. Whilst this one would show up on the base 64, it's of note that the DD version of this game was planned to include different stages with screenshots showing a different HUD and Pokemon not included in the final game, such as Ekans for example. Pokemon Stadium in the West are games which are available on the Nintendo 64 with two entries to choose from, Pokemon Stadium and Pokemon Stadium 2. But in Japan they have Pokemon Stadium 2 and Pokemon Stadium Gold and Silver, so what's going on here? To make things chronologically confusing, the Japanese Pokemon Stadium 2 was the first Pokemon Stadium the West would receive, and Gold and Silver would be sold in our region as Pokemon Stadium 2. So what happened then to the first Pokemon Stadium? Well, this feeds into our Nintendo 64 DD narrative. The first game in Japan was originally intended to be a DD game, but like many, it was shifted over to the regular Nintendo 64. However, more content was planned via a DLC-like expansion pack that would have been provided via the disk drive. With the disk drive completely flopping, content for this game as well as the original game itself were all packaged together and sold in Japan as Pokemon Stadium 2, with us fortunately receiving all of the content in the first Stadium game released in the West. Super Mario 64 2 for the Nintendo 64 DD is perhaps one of the most intriguing video games that we never received in history. However, sadly, information on this project is limited, with it seeming like not a lot of progress was ever actually made. During the Nintendo 64 era, Shigeru Miyamoto would mention in interviews that this was a title he was working on, with the game being planned to have included the return of a rideable Yoshi and, of course, Luigi. It is said that Miyamoto Miyamoto created a playable demo for this one which included a multiplayer experience. It is often theorised that the groundwork that was made for this one was repurposed and used within Mario 64 DS. I don't know about you, but I would have loved them to have finished this one. The most iconic and infamous of all cancelled 64DD games is no doubt Mother 64, the follow-up to Earthbound on the Super Nintendo. Development is said to have started on this project as early as 1994, with most of the team members being involved who worked on the previous game. Looking at the success of Mario 64, the development would later shift from the Super Nintendo to that platform, but as the project grew in scope, development would be shifted once more to the 64DD. Ultimately, this project would become the first ever Paper Mario game, and the rest is now history. This amazing looking title would be showcased at Space World 1999, with the game quickly becoming one of the most anticipated titles around. Not long after, Iwata and Miyamoto announced development resources for this game was being moved to Nintendo's next-gen system, the GameCube. But with the project's level of complexity, this version of the game would be canned too. Eventually, the game would be repurposed once more in a much simpler form for the Game Boy Advance, resulting in the controversial but critically acclaimed Mother 3, the brilliant game that 21 years after its release, the West have still officially been deprived of. Well, those were the most interesting cancelled DD games. If you enjoyed this upload, subscribe and check out my upload on this unreleased Nintendo console, which could have been released instead of the NES. See you soon.